Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for adapting to the change in today's schedule. I'm still sick, so we are going to do this as a recorded lecture today rather than live. So, just as a reminder for where we are and where we're going, we're working our way through the tools of the trade for evolutionary robotics. What are the basic tools you need to be able to evolve virtual robots in a physics engine? We almost finished our discussion last time about building the brain for our robots, which are artificial neural networks. We'll finish that lecture shortly, and then we will move on to lecture 5, evolutionary algorithms. How do we actually go about evolving the brains of our robots in virtual worlds? Just as a reminder, undergrads, you're working on assignment 3, where you're implementing joints that connect links together. And grad students, you're working on assignments 5 and 6. I misspoke last time. You're implementing motors, and then you're doing in assignment 5, and then in assignment 6, you're doing a little bit of refactoring of your code to clean it up and modularize it in preparation for the remaining assignments. Okay, I normally ask if there's any questions, but none of you can respond, so let's just push right on. Just to remind you, we were talking about neural networks last time. Very generally speaking, neural networks are made up of simulated neurons represented as these circles and synapses represented by these arrows, which are connections between neurons. We talked last time about hidden neurons, which added between input neurons and output neurons can allow more complicated transformations from the values arriving at the inputs to the outputs. And we ended last time by looking at one of the problems that neural networks can face, which is known as overfitting. They can end up memorizing patterns and then they fail to be able to generalize to new examples. I showed you this patient and emergency room example last time. This is important for robotics as well. You can imagine that if you evolve an artificial neural network for your robot that allows it to run around in one environment, after evolution, if you take that evolved robot with an evolved neural network and place that robot in a new environment, it fails to behave properly because the robot has in a way memorized the kinds of sensor motor patterns that it experienced in the environment during evolution. This is just to remind us that one of the still outstanding problems in AI and robotics in general is what happens when we train or evolve our robots or AI in safe environments and deploy them out in the world. How can we guarantee or at least reduce the likelihood that they will misbehave in new environments? This is one of the issues that we need to look out for. Okay, so we actually ended last time talking about recurrent connections or recurrent synapses. All of the synapses you've seen so far point away from the sensor or input layer towards the motor or output layer. We can also have recurrent connections that connect together hidden neurons, or connect together motor neurons. And when we're updating the values of the neurons in a neural network that contains recurrent connections, we do so as follows. Let's assume at this particular point in time, these two sensor neurons have these two values. We need to update the value of, or need to compute the value of this motor neuron. We take this value times this value, the weight of this synapse. We take this value and multiply it by the weight of this synapse. We now need to get a value from this neuron and multiply it by the weight of this synapse, but we haven't updated or we haven't computed the value of this neuron yet. So what do? We reach backward in time to time step t, and we get the previous value of that neuron. So it's the current value of this sensor times its synapse, the current value of this sensor times its synapse, plus the past value of this neuron times its synaptic weight. Sum those three values, and that's the value of motor 1. If you think about it, what this motor neuron, or what the robot, so to speak, is doing at this point in time is combining what it currently is experiencing with what it remembers from the past. So recurrent connections add memory to a neural network. This can be very important when we're using a neural network to control a robot, because what a robot should do in a given situation may depend on what it's experienced in its recent past. A robot with a neural network controller that does not contain recurrent connections or recurrent synapses cannot remember anything that happened in the past and is doomed to always do exactly the same thing when it experiences exactly the same sensory input. Okay. All right, there's a problem with recurrent connections though, or there's a challenge to it. Let's imagine this particular neural network. Here's some synaptic weights here. We've got two recurrent connections, one connecting this output node, this output neuron to this output neuron, and a second recurrent connection that connects this output neuron to this output neuron. Assume that we know what we want our output neurons to do whenever they receive a particular pair of inputs. As we saw before when we talked about the backpropagation of error algorithm, we see what the actual values are that arrive at the output neurons. We compare those outputted values to what the values should have been, and we look to see whether there's any error. In this case, output neuron 1 did what it was supposed to do, but output neuron 2 did not do what it was supposed to do, so there is non-zero error at this neuron. The backpropagation of error algorithm tells us that we should then take that non-zero error and start propagating backwards along all of the synapses that arrive at the erroneous neuron. Let's start doing that. If we do, we walk backwards along this synapse, we change its weight. We walk backwards along this synapse to change its weight, and we walk backwards along this synapse to change its weight. The backpropagation of error algorithm says we don't stop until we get to the input layer. So let's keep going. If we backpropagated along this synapse, we're done. We've reached the input layer. If we backpropagate along this synapse, we reach the input layer and we're done. When we backpropagated along this synapse, we did not reach the input layer. So it might have been that this synapse was contributing to the error of this neuron, but maybe this synapse was actually correct, and it was these synapses that were contributing error here, which propagated along to here. So we have to keep going. We have to keep backpropagating. But if we do, we're going to backpropagate along here, change this synapse, and backpropagate along here, which means we're back to here. And it's a mess. We've ended up we can't really localize where the error originated at this neuron. We've had to go back along every single synapse looking for errors and trying to change everything. Whenever we're trying to do this global change or make a change to all the synaptic weights, there's a good chance that we actually might be able to reduce the error here. But because we're making so many changes, we might actually break something that's already working, which is this neuron. So there's a good chance that we might increase the error for another input pattern or at a different neuron. In essence, when we apply the backpropagation of error algorithm to a neural network with recurrent connections, it's like using a sledgehammer on the neural network. We're forced to make huge changes. The reason we're talking about this again is that there are challenges with the backpropagation of error algorithm that we're going to sidestep in this course. By not using the backpropagation of error algorithm, we are simply going to evolve synaptic weights, and that may have a deleterious effect on a robot's behavior, or it might improve that robot's behavior slightly. We're just going to let evolution figure out where the error was and fix it. Okay, a little bit more terminology just so you can connect what you're learning in this course to what you might learn about machine learning in other classes. The example we just saw is known as supervised learning, in the sense that for every possible pattern of inputs that can arrive at the neural network, we know exactly what the output of every neuron should be. So we can supervise the training or the reduction of error. This is the supervisory signal. It tells us exactly what we should have got. And we can then localize errors, at least at the output layer. We know where the output layer made a mistake, and we can take that supervisory signal, and with the backpropagation of error algorithm, we can work backwards to try and fix that error. So supervised learning is in many ways a simpler task than what we're going to look at in this class, which is semi-supervised learning. We're mixing the term evolution and learning. Evolution and learning in nature are very different things. Unfortunately, in AI and machine learning and robotics, sometimes these terms, learning and evolution, are mixed up a little bit. From now on, we're going to just talk about evolution in this class, or evolutionary algorithms, or evolving robots, or evolving artificial neural networks. But you can, these evolutionary algorithms are often seen by the machine learning community as semi-supervised learning algorithms. Why is that? In the case of a robot, for any given pattern that falls on its sensors, we don't know what its motors should do. That's what we want the evolutionary algorithm to figure out for us. We simulate our robot in a physics engine at time step 0. It gets this sensory pattern. The motors do something. At the next time step, for example, maybe the robot experiences this sensor pattern, the robot does this, and keeps going and keeps going. At the end of the simulation, we get back just one global number, which represents the overall behavior of the robot and represents the overall quality of the neural network that's controlling that robot. For a lot of the experiments we're going to see in this course, that overall number represents the distance the robot traveled. We're going to evolve the robot to move. If we evolve the robot to grasp an object, this number might represent the distance between the robot's fingertips and the object. Doesn't really matter. What matters for our purposes is that we don't get back a detailed signal of many numbers, which allow us to localize exactly where the problem is. We get back a semi-supervised signal. We get a global picture of how well or how poorly the neural network caused the robot to move. The task is then to obviously figure out how to alter that neural network, so the next time we drop that altered neural network into the robot, this number increases, gets better. We don't know exactly where in the neural network to make changes to make that happen, so we're in a semi-supervised learning situation. Okay, again, that's just to connect this back to some things you might hear in other classes. Okay, that completes our lecture on artificial neural networks. Obviously, you can't ask me any questions today, but when we meet again in person on Tuesday, if you have any questions about this, please raise them in class. Let's move on now to our discussion of the second tool of the trade for this class, which is evolutionary algorithms. Obviously, there are now multiple courses at UVM that you can take that are exactly about machine learning and neural networks. There is also a sister course to this class, which is called Evolutionary Computation, which goes into great depth about evolutionary algorithms. In this course, we're going to spend just one class, this class, talking about them. So apologies in advance. We're going to skim over a lot of the interesting details about evolutionary algorithms. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Evolutionary algorithms have been around for a long time. Arguably, the very first computer program that was written back in the 1950s was something very much like an evolutionary algorithm. So they have a very long and proud history in computer science. The basic idea is, as the name implies, evolutionary algorithms. They take inspiration from biology, and they take inspiration specifically from Darwinian evolution. So, as a computer scientist, if you look at what happens in nature, you can start to recognize that Darwinian evolution looks a lot like an algorithm. We start with a population of organisms, and those organisms look and act differently. That's the phenotype of an organism. We'll come back to phenotype in a moment. And some of the reasons for why they look and act differently can be traced back to their genes. So not only do these individuals have phenotypic variation, they look and act differently, they also have genetic variation. Their genes are slightly different from one organism to another inside a species. Unfortunately, how you look and act influences whether or not you're able to reproduce and be survived by your offspring. Those that do not produce offspring or die off early, they die off early. Those that survive produce copies of themselves. When they produce copies of themselves, there are slight changes that occur in the genetics during that copying and reproduction process. So we have the more fit organisms, the one that survive and reproduce. Less fit organisms die, and as we've all learned, this leads over time to a population of organisms that are more and more fit to their environment. That's biological evolution. We can take this idea and distill it down into a computer program. So we're going to replace our organisms in this simple example with vectors of numbers, where these vectors of numbers represent a solution to some problem. We haven't defined that problem yet, but we have, instead of a population of organisms, we have a population of candidate solutions. These are random guesses at the beginning to what these solutions are. We then take each solution in turn and apply it to the problem, and we get back a single number, as we just talked about a few slides back. We get back a single number which tells us how well or how poorly that solution solves the given problem. Solutions that obtain a lower score than other solutions in the population are deleted, and the surviving solutions produce offsprings of themselves. We take this particular solution and we make a copy of it. We take this solution and we make a copy of it. When we're copying one solution to create a new solution to fill the gap left by those that have died off, every once in a while we introduce a random mutation. We alter one or a few of the values in the surviving vector that's being copied. Sometimes in an evolutionary algorithm or a genetic algorithm, we sometimes introduce not just mutation, but recombination as well. We might choose at random two of the surviving solutions and take part of the genetic material from one parent and take part of the genetic material from a second parent and glue those two pieces together to make a new solution to the problem that combines parts of two different surviving solutions. Sexual recombination. Okay, that's the basic idea of an evolutionary algorithm. Evolutionary robotics is when the problem is we want a machine that does something, that puts away our dishes or shovels our snow or cleans our floors, and a candidate solution to that problem is a machine that actually does that. We can imagine if the problem is, please clean my floors, you can imagine an infinite number of robots that do a better or worse job at cleaning your floors. And theoretically, we could use an evolutionary algorithm or a genetic algorithm to search over the space of all possible robots, looking for the robot that does the best job of cleaning your floors. So now we're not looking at birds or vectors. We're looking at robots. Here's a evolved robot. This robot was evolved to solve a particular problem, which is to move along a horizontal beam, as you see here. This robot has evolved the ability to do so. I am sure in the space of all possible robots, there is a robot that moves faster and more energy efficiently along this beam, but for our purposes, this is one of the better robots that we found. This is a screenshot from now a very old experiment that I was involved in. As we've talked about a few times already, we are doing this in simulation. We're evolving populations of robots, throwing away the bad robots and making randomly modified copies of the better robots and repeating this process over and over again. In this old experiment, this was the best we came up with. And what's not visualized in this flow chart here is a final step where if we get a robot that's sufficiently interesting or potentially useful, we go to the effort of then taking that evolved robot from simulation and building a physical copy of it. In this particular experiment, we actually went that extra mile and built this robot. And you'll notice, I'm not sure if I can play both of these at the same time. Yeah, okay. You'll notice that there are some similarities and differences between the ways they move, but pretty close, pretty close. The other reason why I wanted to show you this particular pair of images is to remind you of our discussion about embodied cognition last week. One of the advantages of having a body as an intelligent machine is that you can evolve or learn to exploit the physical interaction of your body with the environment to do whatever it is that you need to do. This is one of the more graphic examples of a robot that is exploiting its interaction between its body and its environment. If we were in person, I'd ask you what that is. Most of you have probably figured out what it is. You'll notice that in both the simulated and the physical robot, it's using these blocks at the bottom of its body to actually throw its weight forward. It's actually using that oscillating weight and that momentum to be able to move faster and more energy efficiently along this beam. Those big blocks, that black block that you can see in the physical robot, that's the battery for the robot. So we had to build this robot out of parts that were available in 2002. Unfortunately, batteries were then pretty heavy. They're still pretty heavy. This didn't end up being, we thought this was going to be a disadvantage for the robot. It was going to have to haul this heavy weight as it moved along the beam. Evolution figured out how to sculpt the neural network controller of this robot. We haven't talked about its neural network controller, but this neural network has evolved, or the synaptic weights inside this neural network have evolved such that the robot moves in a particular way in response to sensation that causes it to throw the bottom part of its weight forward and facilitate or ease its ability to move. Okay, so in a nutshell, evolutionary robotics is simply combining a genetic algorithm or an evolutionary algorithm with a robot simulator and then building a physical version of it. Okay. All right. In order to continue our discussion about evolution, we're going to have to perform a thought experiment. This is one of the most famous and powerful thought experiments in all of science. It was formulated by a biologist, Sewell Wright, back in the 1930s, and it's known as the fitness landscape. So what I want you to do is call up in your mind a hypothetical landscape. Let's start with the very simple one. Let's start with the two-dimensional landscape. Let's imagine we have a horizontal axis here, and as we move left or right along this horizontal axis, the height of that landscape obviously changes. I want you to imagine all the way back to Bratenberg Vehicle 1. And I'm sorry, I don't have the ability to annotate on my screen here, so I'm going to draw it with my cursor. Bratenberg Vehicle 1 had a temperature sensor on its front and a single wheel at the back, and its temperature sensor was connected to its motorized wheel with a single synapse. So we have a one sensor neuron, one motor neuron, one synapse neural network controller for Bratenberg Vehicle 1. That vehicle would slow down when it was in cold water. Low temperature sensation leads to low turning of the wheel, and it would move quickly through hot water. High temperature readings would lead to rapid turning of the motorized wheel. Okay. You can then imagine taking the weight, or considering what should be the weight for that single synapse so that the robot does something that you want it to do. Maybe it stops almost completely in cold and goes really, really fast in hot water. The question becomes, what should be the value of that single synaptic weight? That's what I want you to imagine is the horizontal axis here. It says value of gene 1. So I want you to think of that single synaptic weight as a single gene. We're encoding all of the synaptic weights into a vector. In this case, it's a vector of length 1. We have just one number that encodes a solution to our problem, a candidate solution to our problem, which is making Bratenberg Vehicle 1 do whatever it is we want it to do. Imagine that we set the synaptic weight to this particular value, whatever this value is, and we then watch Bratenberg Vehicle 1 either in simulation or reality, and imagine that Bratenberg Vehicle 1 does exactly the opposite of whatever we want it to do. It goes very fast in cold water and slows down in hot water. If our evolutionary algorithm assigns a value to that particular genome or genotype, which is that particular setting of values, just a single value, it's going to set a very low fitness value. The robot with that particular neural network did very poorly. If we increase the value of that synaptic weight a little bit, the robot does a little bit better. If we increase it again, it does a little bit better, and so on. So you can think now, continuing the fitness landscape thought experiment, imagine that you're taking steps backward and forward in this fitness landscape, and you're experiencing different fitnesses. So in essence, what we want an evolutionary algorithm to do is explore this fitness landscape and find, as best it can, high points in this fitness landscape, to find the 1, 2, 3 different possible settings for the single synaptic weight in Bratenberg Vehicle 1 that causes it to do what we want it to do. In fact, there's one particular setting which is the best. Okay, let's pause for a moment and introduce a little bit of terminology. We're going to talk about genotype and phenotype quite a bit in this class. Genotype is basically the vector or the data structure, whatever it is that contains that encodes a candidate solution. So in our cartoon example here, the genotype has one gene in it. That one gene encodes the single synaptic weight for Bratenberg Vehicle 1. The phenotype is the form and function of the robot that results from the genotype. So the genotype, in our example here, the genotype is a single value. Maybe the genotype is 0.3. That's the value of the synaptic weight. We take that 0.3, we label the single synapse in Vehicle 1, and then we let Vehicle 1 start moving around in its environment. As it moves around in its environment and we observe how it moves, that trajectory of its movement is the phenotype. It's the behavior of the robot. Okay. Finally, fitness. Fitness is a measurement that we make on the phenotype. So fitness is never computed from the genotype. Fitness is computed from the phenotype. We watch how vehicle 1 moves, and we assign, in this simple example, a single number, which is how well vehicle 1 did at whatever we wanted it to do. Okay, so armed with that terminology, and here's a summary of these for our purposes. Genotype is the storage of the genetic information, and the phenotype is the system produced by that information, generally speaking. For the purposes of this course, the phenotype is the form and function, or the form and the shape and the behavior of the robot that results from that genotype. Okay, armed with that terminology, let's come back to the fitness landscape for a moment. If the genotype has n genes, the fitness landscape is always going to exist in n+1 dimensions, because the height of the fitness landscape, as the name implies, is always fitness. Yeah? Okay. Let's imagine now Bratenberg Vehicle 2. Remember, Bratenberg Vehicle 2 has 2 photosensors, front left and front right, and 2 motorized wheels, back left and back right. And we have 2 synapses, either contralaterally connecting the sensors to the motors or ipsilaterally connecting the sensors to the motors. Doesn't matter. We have 2 synapses, which means if we're going to evolve behavior for vehicle 2, every time we need to come up with 2 numbers, the weights of those 2 synapses. So now, assuming we're going to evolve vehicle 2 to exhibit some behavior like perhaps circle around a light source, we don't know what the 2 weights for those 2 synapses should be so that the robot circles around a light source. We can imagine a fitness landscape where we now have 2 horizontal dimensions, and every horizontal point in that fitness landscape obviously has a 2-dimensional coordinate. We can take that 2-dimensional coordinate, look at those 2 numbers, take those 2 numbers, apply them as synaptic weights to the 2 synapses. That's the genotype, that pair of numbers. We then let go of the robot. We let the robot start moving around in a simulated or physical environment, labeled with those 2 synaptic weights, measure how well it does at, for example, circling around a light source, and assign a single number for how well it does at circling around the light source. And that single number is the 3rd coordinate. It's the value we assign to that genotype. And we get a 3-dimensional fitness landscape. In this cartoon example you can see here, this particular pair of synaptic weight values produces a robot that circles around the light source very well. This particular pair of synaptic weights causes the robot to do a terrible job at circling around the light. Maybe it turns around and runs away from the light. There's a whole bunch of other pairs of synaptic weights that cause the robot to do a so-so job of circling around the light. Okay, take a moment to absorb the fitness landscape metaphor. We're going to use it to explore a series of evolutionary algorithms. Okay, we're going to look now at a series of evolutionary algorithms that start very simple and get more and more sophisticated. They increasingly start to resemble actual biological evolution. Let's start with arguably the simplest evolutionary algorithm. It's so simple that you probably wouldn't even consider this an evolutionary algorithm at all. Bear with me, I'll explain why in a moment. This very, very simple evolutionary algorithm, or maybe just a search algorithm, is called the hill climber, and here's why. In the hill climber, we're going to start the hill climber by creating a random population of genotypes. Here's one genotype. Remember, it's a string of numbers. The vector could be of length 2 if we're evolving pairs of weights for vehicle 2. This vector could be of length 1 if we're evolving a single synaptic weight for Bratenberg vehicle 1. Okay. In the hill climber, the population size is always one, meaning in essence, there is no population. In the hill climber at any given time, there is only one candidate solution to the given problem. Okay, let's create that single vector. Let's create that single vector and let's fill it with random numbers. You'll see over here, we've got our fitness landscape picture again. I'm just drawing it in 2 dimensions. In this cartoon example, we have just one gene. So let's imagine we have just one vector. We have a population size of 1 for the hill climber, and the length of that vector is just 1. We have just one floating point value. So let's imagine we're trying to find a single synaptic weight for vehicle 1. We create that single synaptic weight at random, drop that into vehicle 1, let vehicle 1 start to do its thing. This is known as the parent solution, represented by P here. Let's assume that we randomly created a synaptic weight that was pretty high in magnitude. It's pretty far to the right here. And it causes the vehicle 1 to do a pretty poor job at whatever it is we wanted vehicle 1 to do. It doesn't obtain a very high height on the fitness landscape. Okay, what do we do at this point? You can see that we want to go in this direction. We want to push up here, but from the point of view of the hill climber, it does not see the fitness landscape. The only thing that the hill climber sees is the height of this single point. I want you to imagine that you want to climb Mount Mansfield, but unfortunately you choose to climb Mount Mansfield on an incredibly foggy day. You know enough to drive to one of the parking lots next to Mount Mansfield. You then turn off your phone, no cheating, no GPS. How do you get to the top of Mount Mansfield? First of all, I don't recommend actually trying this. It's not really clear. You start in the parking lot at a pretty low altitude. What do? Well, one thing you can do is take a random step in a given direction and see whether you increase or decrease in height. That's exactly what the hill climber does. As promised, it's a very simple algorithm, but not the smartest algorithm there is. What does that mean? That means we take our parent solution, which is a vector of length 1, remember, in this simple example. The hill climber makes a copy of that single length 1 vector, and when it makes a copy of that vector, it makes a random alteration to the values in that vector. There's only one value in that vector, so it's this value that gets changed by a slight amount. In my cartoon example here, that random mutation increases that single gene value or that single synaptic weight value by a small amount, which means from the point of view of the hill climber, it's moved one step to the right along this horizontal axis. We take that new synaptic weight, drop it back into vehicle 1, and again, watch how vehicle 1 does. In this cartoon example here, the child solution actually does worse than the parent solution. Vehicle 1 does an even worse job at whatever we wanted it to do compared to vehicle 1 when it was labeled with the synaptic weight from the parent. Let's go back to the parking lot next to Mount Mansfield. It's a foggy day. You walk out of the parking lot and you go downhill a little bit. You're probably heading in the wrong direction. What do? You would probably do exactly what the hill climber does, which is delete the child. The hill climber throws the child away, goes back to the parent, makes another copy of the parent, and again randomly mutates the parent, and maybe now the second child actually has a lower synaptic weight than the parent. We take that lower synaptic weight, run it on vehicle 1, and we now realize that vehicle 1 actually does a better job at whatever we wanted it to do than vehicle 1 did when it was labeled with the parent synaptic weight. In essence, the hill climber has figuratively taken a step in the right direction. We now have a parent with lower fitness than the child. What do you think the hill climber does at this point? It throws away the parent, keeps the child. The child becomes the new parent. So there'd be a P sitting here, and we repeat the process. The parent produces a child. We evaluate the child. If the child's fitness is lower than the parent, we throw away the child. If the child's fitness is higher than the parent, we throw away the parent. That's it. The hill climber repeats this over and over again. Let's go back to the example of you on in the foothills of Mount Mansfield. You always retrace your step if you go downhill, but as long as you take a step that increases your own altitude, you stay where you are. Probably won't take you long to realize that that's not going to help you get, you're going to be very unlikely to get to the top of Mount Mansfield. You can see that on our fitness landscape here. Parents and children keep reproducing over and over again to the hill climber, and the hill climber will probably gradually climb this hill. But when it gets up here and there's a P sitting up here, P is going to start producing children nearby through mutation that are all worse than P. So all of those children are going to keep getting thrown away, and P will probably continue producing children forever and never escape this local hill that it's gotten caught on. This is an important issue in evolutionary algorithms in general. What this what this local hill is known as is a local optimum, meaning in a local space. Local meaning in the horizontal direction. So for synaptic weights of about this value, this is the optimal solution. Here's another local optimum. Within this range of synaptic weights, this is the best synaptic weight. This is the local optimum. If theoretically we were able to visit every possible setting for this single synaptic weight, we would realize that there is a global optimum. This is the best setting for that single synaptic weight that's possible. What happens with weak evolutionary algorithms, like the hill climber, is that they tend to become trapped on local optima. So the hill climber, simple to implement, is a relatively weak search algorithm. Doesn't do a very good job at search. So can we complicate the hill climber a little bit so that it is less likely to get trapped on local optima? What's the simplest thing we could do? What's the simplest thing we could do? Instead of you going to Mount Mansfield on a foggy day and hoping to find a slope that takes you all the way to Mount Mansfield, call a bunch of your friends, have them go to a bunch of different parking lots that surround Mount Mansfield. Everybody starts taking local steps and continue moving if they're moving uphill, but retrace their steps if they end up going downhill, and keep texting one another as you do this. And hope that one of you manages to land on a slope that takes them all the way to the top of Mount Mansfield. That's the parallel hill climber. As the name implies, it's very much like the hill climber. It just runs a bunch of hill climbers in parallel. So now, when we initialize the population, we initialize the population with more than one genome or one genotype. We've got a bunch of them, which are going to be represented as parent 1, parent 2, and so on. For each of those parent solutions, we're going to set the internal value to a random value, which means those initial random parents are going to materialize at different points along the horizontal axis. P1 lands here, P2 lands here, and then both P1 and P2 run one step of the hill climber. P1 produces one child, P2 produces a child, and if the child is worse than the parent, if parent one's child is worse than it, that child is killed off. and parent 1 is allowed to produce another offspring. In this case, parent 2 produced a child that has higher fitness than its parent, so the parent is killed off, C2 becomes the new P2, and we then repeat one step of the hill climber over here and another one over here. Yeah. So we're increasing the odds that someone is going to land on the lower slopes of what turns out to be the global optimum. I've picked the positions of P1 and P2 on purpose here to illustrate that this slightly more powerful evolutionary algorithm, the parallel hill climber, still can get stuck on local optima. P1 over here is going to eventually, and its offspring are probably eventually going to climb, but then get stuck on this local optimum. P2 and its descendants is probably going to end up getting stuck on this local optimum. So better, but not perfect. Can we do better? Let's add in an additional detail from biological evolution, which is sexual recombination. For now, we've just been considering mutation. When we take a parent and produce a copy of that parent, we introduce a a random change to one of the values in the child's genotype. In the genetic algorithm, which is one of the oldest and probably the most popular kind of evolutionary algorithm, we're going to introduce sexual recombination. Another note about terminology, the genetic algorithm is such a famous algorithm that often the name of the field as a whole, which is evolutionary algorithms, is referred to as genetic algorithms. As you've already seen, and as I'm going to try and drive home in the rest of this lecture, evolutionary algorithms is a field of study, and within that field of study, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of evolutionary algorithms, one of which is the genetic algorithm. Okay, how does the genetic algorithm work? It starts out very much like the parallel hill climber. We start by creating several random genotypes, several candidate solutions to our problem. We're going to stick with our cartoon example of vehicle 1 with 1 synaptic weight. So again, we have 2 random solutions that end up at these horizontal positions in the fitness landscape. As we just saw in the previous example, we evaluate P1 on vehicle 1, we evaluate P2 on vehicle 1, we see how well they do. Now we take these 2 individuals, and when they produce children, they do not produce a child alone. We randomly choose 2 solutions in the population. In this population, we only have P1 and P2, so we choose P1 and P2. We then choose a random point along the genotype of parent 1 and parent 2, and we cut the genotype of parent 1 at that horizontal position, and we cut parent 2 at exactly the same horizontal position. In my cartoon example here, we've chosen this cut point after the second gene. My apologies, I'm kind of mixing metaphors here. We're dealing with a fitness landscape over here that just has a genotype of length 1. Over here, in order to illustrate recombination, we have genomes that contain more than 1 gene. My apologies. Okay, so we cut at these 2 positions, and we take all of the genetic material to the left of this cut point from parent 1, which is shown in red, and we copy that into child 1. We then take all of the genetic material that's to the right of the cut point from parent 2 and copy that into child 2. So we're taking some of the genetic material from parent 1, we're taking the left-hand genetic material from parent 1 and the right-hand genetic material from parent 2, copying those two pieces and gluing them together to make a new child. In the genetic algorithm, after we've performed this recombination event, we also walk along this new child genome and from time to time slightly randomly change some of these numbers. So we add mutation on top. So the genetic algorithm contains mutation and sexual recombination. Continuing my example down here, these parents might actually end up producing a second child in which now we take the right-hand material from parent 1 and we take the left-hand material from parent 2 and glue those together to make a second child, so that now we have two children that are genetically dissimilar from one another, represented by the numbers here, but still resemble their parents in some way. They are genetically related to their parents. What does this end up doing? Well, as you can see here, this particular child has more numeric differences from this parent and from this parent than if we just do mutation. This child is more numerically similar to its parent than this child is to its parent. The fact that, let's call this C1 is more genetically dissimilar from parent 1 and parent 2 means that child 1 has moved further horizontally in the fitness landscape. Everybody see that? Okay. So that's a good thing. We're introducing more difference into the child compared to the parent, which means it might be possible if the parent is trapped on the slopes of a local optimum for the child to escape from that local optimum. In my cartoon example here, child 2 was not so lucky. Child 2 is still pretty far from both its parents horizontally, compared to here, where we can see that child 2 is not that horizontally distant from its parent, and same thing with child 1. It's further, but unfortunately C2 is still trapped on the same local optimum as at least this parent. C1 over here in our cartoon example has been lucky. It's inherited some genetic material from P1 and P2 that it has allowed it to escape from both local optima that its two parents are respectively trapped on, and it invades a whole new space, a whole new way of behaving. And unbeknownst to C1, remember this whole thing is bathed in fog. The genetic algorithm can only see the heights of the points that it's tried so far. Suddenly C1 is higher than anyone has been before. And as C1 continues to produce offspring, in this cartoon example, one of its descendants is likely to reach the global optimum. Okay, so what has happened in the case of C1? C1 has gotten lucky that through a series of random events, we randomly choose which pair of parents to pair up to produce an offspring. We've randomly chosen where along the genotypes of these two parents to cut. Through those random events, we've ended up bringing together good parts of parent 1 and parent 2. Parent 1 and parent 2 are have a low height, meaning poor fitness. So there's something wrong with both parents. They're not so good at something, but whatever it is that they were bad at, that got spliced out and wasn't brought into C1. So C1 is inheriting the best of both parents and avoided inheriting the worst of both parents. That is, in a nutshell, why sexual recombination evolved in nature and why it's useful for evolving robots and all sorts of other things in machine learning, in AI and robotics. So the genetic algorithm, it's not perfect, and it's a little more complicated than the parallel hill climber, but it tends to do a better job at escaping local optima. At this point, students usually have a number of questions. The most popular question is, how can you guarantee that the genetic algorithm or any evolutionary algorithm will eventually find the global optimum? If any of you are thinking of that question, good for you. It's an important question, and the answer is nobody knows. Evolutionary algorithms are relatively simple algorithms in the space of all machine learning algorithms, but they all share a limitation at the moment, which is we cannot guarantee that even if we run the genetic algorithm or any other evolutionary algorithm for a very, very long time, that it will find the global optimum. Often what an evolutionary algorithm will do is to find a very, very, very good solution. We don't know whether it's the optimal solution. I mentioned this way back at the beginning of this course. Biological evolution is not an optimizer. Uh, as many of you know, the human body is not perfect. The human brain is not perfect, but it's good enough for most of us to survive to childbearing age. And protect our children until they reach childbearing age. Every organism on Earth is good enough to survive and sometimes reproduce. Biological evolution is not an optimizer, it's a satisficer. Same thing goes for evolutionary algorithms. They are not optimizers, they are satisficers. Okay. Let's keep going. We're going to look at the evolution strategy now. This is an interesting algorithm. We're not going to use it in this class, but I think it's worth mentioning. In this case, in the evolution strategy, it looks very much like the genetic algorithm. So I've removed a lot of the details that they share in common. The one thing that's different about the evolution strategy is the data structure that encodes the genotype. So the genotypes in an evolution strategy are actually matrices. They've got two rows in them. They've got two rows in them and n columns representing the n genes, whereas in a genetic algorithm, we have just a 1 by n vector. Evolution strategy, 2 by n matrix. Okay. Why is that the case? Let's go back for a moment to the fitness landscape. Let's imagine that an evolutionary algorithm is running, and the evolutionary algorithm has found this particular genotype, which produces a phenotype that obtains this particular fitness. It's doing okay. Let's imagine that this particular parent solution is now going to start producing children, where it either combines its genetic material with another parent to produce that child, or it simply produces a copy of itself and some mutations are introduced. However the children are produced, the children more or less fall this horizontal distance away from the parent. We're introducing this idea of step size here. So the more we change the copied genetic material of the parent, the further away horizontally the child will fall from the parent. We can actually boil that down to a number known as the step size, which is exactly what an evolution strategy does. We'll come back to that in a moment. Just think of 0.1 is meaning that any child produced by this parent can be at most 0.1 to the right of this parent or 0.1 to the left of this parent. If you think about the distribution of all of those possible children, you can see that 50% of them are going to be worse than the parent and 50% are going to be better than the parent. So what that means is it won't take long for this parent, if it's producing offspring, to eventually produce one that does better than itself. Let's imagine this particular fitness landscape now, which you can see has many more local optima in it than this one does. And you can see that the slopes are steeper. This is a more rough fitness landscape, and it's much tougher to search, as you can imagine. Any one step might cause you to fall off any of these local optima. So let's imagine we have this particular solution here, which after a lot of evolutionary search is actually doing pretty well. It's actually unbeknownst to the evolutionary algorithm, it's found a point that's on the slope of the global optimum. Remember, the evolutionary algorithm doesn't know this. This whole mountain range is wreathed in fog. Okay. Let's again imagine that this particular parent is producing children that are at most 0.1 to the right of it in terms of gene value, and at most 0.1 to the left of this point in gene values. So going back to vehicle 1, this means that the synaptic weight of a child can be at most 0.1 greater than the synaptic weight of the parent. And a child can have a synaptic weight that is at most 0.1 less than the synaptic weight of this parent. In this particular fitness landscape, a step size of 0.1 is going to ensure that this parent is very unlikely to ever produce a child that's better than itself. Any children that fall in this horizontal range are going to be worse than this parent. Any children that fall within this horizontal range are going to be worse than the parent. And it's only within this very narrow range that children are going to be better than this parent. This means that even though we can't see these peaks, the step size at this point in time should be less than 0.1. This parent should be producing children that are more genetically similar to it than in this example. How do we break this catch-22? The evolution strategy does this by, again, encoding gene values in its genome. But in the same genome, every gene value has a corresponding step size. This is known in evolution strategies as the strategy parameters. What this means is that if this parent, represented by this genotype here, produces an offspring, we copy all the values of this parent vector into a child vector. And as we copy each number, we're going to mutate those numbers, but we're going to mutate them by a magnitude dictated by the step size associated with the value, or with that gene. So if we copy 0.3, we might modify the value 0.3 by anywhere between 0.2 and 0.4, 0.1 less than 0.3 or 0.1 more than 0.3. When we modify, as we're copying the parent gene values into the child gene values, when we hit this particular gene, this one is going to be mutated more than this gene was. This particular gene is going to be mutated less than these other genes. So we're allowing the evolution strategy to set the step sizes, how much we mutate any given gene by. The last twist and the beautiful part of the evolution strategy is that the step sizes themselves are mutated. So imagine multiple parents lying somewhere in this region. Parents that encode smaller step sizes are going to produce children that are closer to it in the fitness landscape than other parents nearby that have higher step sizes. Those parents are going to produce children that fall further away from it. The parent that just by chance is producing more similar children, its descendants will start climbing this peak better than the parent that's producing children that are further from it. And we're going to end up with more genotypes in the population with smaller step sizes. So what the evolution strategy does is actually evolve over evolutionary time how far or how closely children fall to the parent. And evolution tunes those magnitudes of jumps by where those particular points lie in the fitness landscape. An evolution strategy, when it's running, if it's running on a fitness landscape that's relatively smooth, those step sizes will evolve to be bigger so that things are jumping around more. An evolution strategy that's running on fitness landscapes that are rougher, like this one here, will start to evolve step sizes that are smaller. We'll see less and less differences between children and parents. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left, which is great. That should be just enough to talk about the final evolutionary algorithm I want to talk about today. That final evolutionary algorithm is not called symbolic regression. It's called genetic programming. But before we talk about genetic programming, I want to talk about the problem that genetic programming is really good at solving. The best way to understand genetic programming is to watch it solve a problem, and that problem is symbolic regression. So let's talk about the problem first, and then we'll talk about genetic programming, which is a solution to that problem. Imagine we make a bunch of observations. We have a whole bunch of x values, which is our independent variable. We know what those values are. And for each value of x, we then observe the value of y, which is our dependent variable. And if we plot all of that data, we can immediately see that there seems to be some sort of pattern or relationship between x and y. You'll notice that the values of y tend to dip around a value of x, an x value of 3, and they tend to increase on either side of that value. Hopefully that will dimly, somewhere in your dim recollection, this will remind you of high school algebra. And you might remember what the solution to this problem is, but bear with me. Let's imagine instead of you trying to write down a function for x, trying to write down y as a function of x, we task an evolutionary algorithm with coming up with this problem. The evolutionary algorithm, in this case, the candidate solutions to the problem are equations. Here's one candidate equation, which is y equals x. If we draw y equals x, and then we ask how well does this equation capture the relationship between x and y, we can see it does a pretty poor job of capturing that relationship. If we look at how far the observations are from the actual y equals x line, we can see there's a lot of error here. So in this particular evolutionary algorithm that we're going to see in a moment, it's going to try not to maximize fitness, but it's going to try and minimize error. This can be a little confusing. We're going to see this again as we continue through this course. Some of the robots we're going to evolve are trying to minimize error, which could be the distance of their hand from an object, or they're trying to maximize fitness. They're trying to move as far as they can from their starting point. For this example, we're going to try and evolve populations of equations, and better equations have lower error. Returning to our fitness landscape for a moment, when we're minimizing error, we replace fitness on the vertical axis with error, and now we're going to try and search for points that move into the deepest valley. So when we're minimizing error, here's one local optimum. Here's the global optimum. Other than that, everything stays exactly the same. Maximize fitness or minimize error. Okay. All right. So we find that this particular equation gets high error, so it's probably deleted from the population and replaced with something else. Let's, hopefully you were able to work this out in your head. It's okay if you couldn't. Here's a second equation, and let's imagine this evolutionary algorithm actually discovered this equation. This particular equation gets low error, or high fitness if you want to think about it that way. And you can see that visually. The observations now are closer on average to this equation than this one is. Yeah. Okay, so what is the problem and what are the candidate solutions? So the problem that we're trying to solve in this case is we would like to write down a mathematical equation that describe, or the problem is we'd like to find the relationship between x and y. A candidate solution to that problem is an equation. Here's one candidate solution, here's a second candidate solution. So in this case, our genotypes are equations. Remember, a candidate solution is encoded in a genotype. So a candidate solution is an equation. And phenotype, or the behavior produced by that equation, is this line. How far is the line described by this equation from these points? Okay. Just to try and ground this so relatively abstract discussion, here's a real world problem. If you ever spend any time in Burlington in the summer, sometimes parts of Lake Champlain are closed to swimming because of toxic algal blooms. It turns out it's really, really hard to predict where and when a bloom will form in the lake. That being said, the Rubenstein School here at UVM has spent many years collecting data from the lake. They take measurements at different points in the lake at different times of the year, in different years. And at any point in the lake at a given time, they measure different features of the water. How much nitrogen is in the water, how much phosphorus is in the water at that time, what's the temperature of the water, how easy is it to look through the water, how transparent is the water, how much rainfall has there been in the last day, and so on. These are all our independent variables, x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, and we want to see whether we can find a relationship that, or an equation built from all of these parts that predict T, the actual amount of toxic algae found in the water at that time. So what you're looking at here is just a single x value and a single y value. Here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 x's. So we have x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5. I can't draw that. We would have 5 quote unquote horizontal dimensions. And then the sixth vertical dimension is the error. The sixth vertical dimension is T, toxic algal blooms. Yeah. Okay. So what is this equation? Nobody knows, but some researchers here at UVM have actually applied genetic programming to try and find out. Here we go. As I mentioned, in genetic programming that's trying to solve symbolic regression, genomes, here's one, genotypes, here's genotype 1, genotype 2, or parent 1 and parent 2. They are not encoded as vectors of numbers. They're encoded as in a tree data structure. Some of you taking this course have not taken a data structures course, so this may be a little confusing. What I'll invite you to do is notice that this tree is made up of mathematical operators, like over here, multiplication, plus, and each leaf in the tree, all of these nodes that do not have any nodes below them, are made up of state variables like x or floating point numbers, 0.8, 1.4. So as always, when we're starting an evolutionary algorithm, we usually create a population of random candidate solutions. So how did we create P1 and how did we create P2? Let's start with P1. We start by, we want to create this genotype at random. So we make a bag, and in that bag, we throw in all the possible mathematical operations that we think might be a part of this equation. And we also throw into this bag all of the variables. So this just says X and Y, but if we're doing this problem, we throw in N, P, W, B, and R, and T. We throw them in here, and we throw in some constants as well. We'll see why in a moment. We shake up the bag, so we got a whole bunch of operators and operands. We reach into that bag, we pull something out of that bag at random, and in this case, we pulled out the multiplication operator. That becomes the root of our tree. The multiplication operator requires two arguments, so we create two outgoing edges from this tree. We need to multiply two things together. We don't know what those things are yet, so let's go to the first branch of the tree, put the multiplication operator back in the bag, shake the bag up again, reach into the bag, and this time we pull out plus. Plus also requires two operators. Throw plus back in the bag, shake it up, reach in to the bag again. In this case, we pull out 0.8. 0.8 does not require any arguments, so we've created a leaf to the tree. We go back up to the plus. We need two arguments. We've already created one. We need a second argument, so we shake up the bag. We reach in again. In this case, we pulled out at random x, and we've completed this part of the tree. We have to go back up to the root of the tree. Multiplication, we filled in this left-hand branch. We still need to fill in, still need to randomly set the second argument for this multiplication. So we shake up our full bag again, reach in and pull out, at this case, a random value, which is 1.4. And we have now created an equation. We have now created an equation at random, and we have our first genotype. I will invite you to, while this is fresh in your mind and this lecture is about to end, do this, go through this operation with this bag to create P2. Reach into the bag, pull out division, and see if you can construct this. We will finish this lecture on Tuesday, when I'm pretty sure I'll be back to see you all in person. Just as a reminder, you have a quiz due tonight. Undergraduates, you're working on quiz number 3. You're working on assignment number 3. Graduate students, you're working on assignments 5 and 6. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you all on Tuesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.